uh, the nature of approaches and methods of normative inquiry, and around the question, can empirical science tell us what is right or good? That question is really our point of departure. And we'll be discussing, I'll begin with a basic overview um, about the nature of reason and justification that's common to both empirical research and normative inquiry. Then I'll discuss the claim that normative inquiry is independent from empirical inquiry, that it is a separate mode of thought and inquiry. And we'll briefly discuss some features of normative inquiry, including the distinction between ethical and moral inquiry, and then the distinction between personal and public normative domains, that there is a distinction between our own personal ethics and a public morality pertaining to such things as justice, etc. And then we'll explore the possibility of a rational basis of normative reasons of justification, what would count, or what would be the rational basis of justification pertaining to normative claims. And we'll explore the idea of methods of justifiable acceptability and that will lead us to what we could call the moral point of view. And then if we have time, we can discuss and look at in more detail some examples of normative methodologies, some prominent examples. So to begin, the validity of both knowledge and normative claims, claims of truth and claims of what is right and what is good, are grounded in justification. The standard definition, for example, of knowledge historically has been knowledge is justified true belief. Something cannot be knowledge if it's false, but also at the core of it is the idea of how would we go about justifying the truth of a knowledge claim or knowledge proposition. The same is, as we'll see, the same is true for normative claims. Any kind of claim of what is right, what is just, or what is good, what is of value from ethical value, requires justification. And justification refers to reasons that support or refute the validity of the claim. So justification is central, is a core element of inquiry in general, and justification refers to the offering of reasons that support or refute the claim. In turn, justification has a basic structure, a basic logical structure, and that structure pertains to two elements. It's methods of inquiry is the first element. Knowledge claims and normative claims are valid if and only if they have been derived from a valid and reliable method of inquiry. So the justification in part is based upon the validity of the method of inquiry. And secondly, a second element of the structure of justification is that justification appeals to standards of validity, which refer to an intersubjective agreement from a commonly shared position, a point of view. So in empirical study, as we well know, the point of view of a theory and evidence grounded in valid and reliable methodology forms the standard of validity. And our main question today is from regarding normative claims, what would constitute normative justificatory reasons. That is, what are the standards of validity of normative claims? So that provides us with kind of a broad overview or a broad framework for thinking about justification. We turn to the essential question of the independence of normative inquiry. And this is the question, can empirical science tell us what is right and good? In other words, can normative values and principles be derived from facts? First of all, we have to distinguish between empirical and normative questions and claims. Empirical questions and claims refer to questions of what is, or statements about what is in fact. That normative questions and claims refer to what should be rather than what is. So at a basic level, at their foundation, empirical and normative questions are distinct in that one refers to what is, and normative questions refer to what should be. Now we can think about the relationship between facts and normative judgments. Empirical facts inform. The claim here is that empirical facts inform but do not determine normative judgments. That the knowledge of consequences cannot tell us what consequences to value. For example, knowledge of consequences, empirical fact can only tell us what actions will or will not result in the consequences that we value, but it won't tell us what to value. And this refers to David Hume's insight that there's an unbridgeable gulf between facts and values, that we cannot derive an ought or what should be from what is. To attempt to do so is to commit Hume's naturalistic fallacy. In other words, that normative inquiry isn't intended to explain or predict behavior as is the case for empirical science, empirical social science. Normative inquiry is designed to prescribe and to justify. Normative inquiry doesn't assume the position of an observer as such, but one who has to choose and one who has to be responsible for their choice. This can be referred to as the distinction between theoretical reason and practical reason that goes back at least to Aristotle, that empirical science and empirical inquiry is a form of reason which is theoretical in its nature, whereas normative inquiry refers to what we could call practical reason, reason about what to value and what and how to determine what is right. To illustrate the idea of the independence of normative inquiry, independent from empirical inquiry, we can look at three thought experiments. The first thought experiment is I'm standing on a train track, and there's a train approaching at a high speed, so fast that the train, if I remain on the track, the train will be unable to stop, and if I remain on the track, I will die. I will be killed by the impact of the train. The question is, should I step off the train track? What determines whether I remain on the track or step off the track? The empirical fact in this case is that the train is approaching, but the train and at first glance, that would suggest that I should step off the track. But if we look at it more deeply, my decision to remain or step off is based on normative considerations that are independent of the empirical facts of the case. That whether I stay on the track or step off the track depends on whether I currently value my life or whether I value human life. It also pertains to questions of what is the right thing to do. Is suicide morally justifiable? Is it morally right or is it morally wrong to commit suicide? So the idea here is that the empirical facts in themselves cannot determine my action, solely determine my action. And we have to appeal to normative considerations, which are distinct from the empirical facts. The second example or experiment is the famous trolley problem. Let's say you are the operator of a trolley that's running along a track, and the track malfunctions. There's a malfunction in the track, and you have to make a decision where to steer the track in one direction or another, down one track or another, and the brakes have failed. So you can't stop the trolley. You have to make a decision on which track to pursue. On one track are 5 workers who are working on the track and are oblivious to your oncoming track if you decide to go down that track. Those 5 workers will most likely be killed. On the second track is one person, but that one person happens to be Stephen Hawking, who has unfortunately got his wheelchair caught on the track and can't move. Stephen Hawking, very famous genius physicist. What do you do? Which track do you choose? The empirical facts in this case can't determine the answer to that question. It's a question of, well, do I save our 5 lives? Saving 5 lives, is that more morally justifiable than saving one life? Is, in this case, saving one life of a prominent and important person more valuable than saving the lives of others? In order to solve the problem, we have to appeal to normative considerations that are independent of the empirical facts of the case. A third example is from Amartya Sen, and the economist philosopher who set up this thought experiment with 3 children. There are 3 children and 1 flute. And the question becomes, who should get the flute? The empirical facts of the case are that one child is very needy, is very disadvantaged. A second child is very adept at playing the flute, has great talent in playing the flute. The third child has made the flute. They have constructed and made the flute. Those are the empirical facts of the case. But those empirical facts alone cannot tell us who should get the flute, who should receive the flute. And it depends on what we value and what we think is right in terms of the standards of distribution of this particular good, the good of the flute. So these examples or experiments suggest that when considering important questions of what we should do or what we should choose or how we should distribute things, that empirical facts cannot um, cannot be the sole determinant of our choice, that we have to appeal to normative considerations. Um, we have to consider ethical values and moral principles of right. So, having suggested that the that normative inquiry is independent, has an independence from empirical science, that it is its own mode of inquiry. We can further break down that normative inquiry into two basic kinds of inquiry, ethical and moral. From this perspective, ethics or ethical inquiry and discourse refers to considerations of the good. Uh, so we can think of ethics as pertaining to choices about what is good. And that entails such questions as what ends should we pursue? How should we live? What should we value? What constitutes a good life? So, ethics referring to considerations of the good or considerations of values. Morality, on the other hand, is distinct from ethics, and moral inquiry distinct from ethical inquiry, in the sense that it does not consider the good as such, but refers to considerations of the right. And moral inquiry refers to such questions as what rights and obligations should we affirm? What do we owe each other? What defines right relationship? Do we have unconditionally binding moral norms? If so, what is the rational basis of these norms? And what should be our principles of justice? All these types of questions refer to considerations of what is right and wrong, conversely, rather than what is good or valuable as such. Furthermore, there is a distinction between personal and public normative domains. Personal ethical considerations refer to individual conceptions and choices of the good life. It refers to our individual values, what we value as individuals, and our personal ethical choices can, can and are informed by a number of considerations, including our comprehensive philosophical and religious doctrines. Uh, Also, we have a personal morality, that we each of us have individual or can have individual conceptions and choices of norms and principles concerning our special relationships with others. So questions of individual special relationships pertain to our personal morality. What is right and wrong in relations to those that we have special relationships with, our family, our friends, our coworkers, etc. Uh, Distinct from these personal, ethical, and moral considerations are public ethical and moral considerations, which refer to, on the ethical level, conceptions and choices of collective goods and values, values that are commonly shared uh, in the public, commonly shared among citizens of the society, and conceptions of the common good, uh, etc. There are also public moral conceptions and choices that pertain to public principles of right that we uh, uh, can can accept and affirm as citizens. And these public moral considerations normally refer to principles and claims of justice in a variety of different ways. So another important distinction in normative inquiry is between the personal and the public domain. Personal morality, personal ethics, and then public ethics and morality is an important distinction, and they can be their uh, their sources and their justification are can be quite different. So that leads us to the question of what is the rational basis of normative reasons of justification? All of our personal and especially public claims, ethical and moral claims, we can ask, do those claims have a rational basis? That is, are there reasons, valid reasons that can justify the validity of those claims? Can they justify the validity of our moral principles? Historically, there have been two fundamental sources of or foundations of normative reasons of justification. One has been, which is very prominent throughout history, is a claim of an independent moral order, that there exist moral principles and value and ethical values that inhere in the nature of the universe itself, or that inhere in some kind of divine or natural law. Uh, so this point of view suggests that there is an independent ethical and moral order that human beings can intuit, can rationally comprehend, or that through some process of revelation has been revealed to them. Moses coming down out of Mount Sinai with the Ten Commandments is an example of a revelation-based instance of an independent moral order. And most religious points of view have this orientation, that there exists a basic order to the universe. A second source or a rational basis of normative reasons is our custom, convention, and thereby authority. Often we might appeal to, and we often do appeal to our social customs, our cultural customs, the established conventions of our society, our social norms as the basis of making ethical and moral choices. And those customs are used as reasons to validate the justifiability of our choice. The problem with custom is that the fact that a norm, a social norm, or a common ethical value is operative in a culture, even widely shared in a culture or society, does not actually justify it. It does not mean that we ought to follow it as a convention just because it exists. And we know that many customs, many social norms turn out to be morally unjustifiable. They turn out to be, upon further reflection, unjustifiable or invalid, and are often rejected. An example would be the custom of men dueling, which was thought to be of great moral justifiability as a social norm, was upon further reflection deemed to be unjustifiable and then dropped from social custom. An extreme example is the existence of slavery as a convention and custom of society, which was with us throughout the human experience, and the claim that slavery was morally justifiable upon further reflection, further critical scrutiny, led to its rejection as being morally justifiable. So this gives rise to the question of normative justifiability, and how do we determine normative justifiability? What is the rational basis of normative reasons of justification? If custom is inadequate to give us full justification, and if we, as many would conclude, that there the claim that an independent moral order exists that is universal has come under scrutiny in the late 20th century and early 21st century, that an independent moral order, there's no agreement about an independent moral order, and therefore appeal to that order cannot provide a rational basis for at least a public morality. It can provide a rational basis, of course, for individuals and their individual religious beliefs. However, in a pluralistic society, an appeal to a particular independent moral order seems to be invalid. So then how do we determine normative justifiability if we reject the idea, especially in its public sense, if we reject the idea of an independent moral order and and custom as a complete justification in itself? And this has led normative theory to the articulation of post-metaphysical or freestanding approaches, which have become the dominant point of view, at least in Western philosophy. So this diagram, so we can go more into detail into justification and into a post-metaphysical approach to justification. So social norms, considerations of the common good, and principles of justice that regulate the basic structure of society require justification. And there are two basic levels of justification here. One is acceptance, and we could call this de facto established validity. That is, there is in the society acceptance of the norms, of the conception of the common good, of the principles of justice as public ethical and moral considerations. And de facto established validity or acceptance occurs when individual citizens achieve a coherence between their personal values and the public values and principles of right that they that exist in their society. So there, when the basic principles of justice are accepted as being coherent with one's own good and what one believes is one's own value, then that achieves a kind of justification based in acceptance. However, as suggested earlier, that acceptance, that social acceptance of the norm or the principle or the conception of the good, common good, is insufficient in itself. It also requires ideal validity. It requires that we achieve justifiable acceptability. And this is the idea of moral justification, that more full justification and the legitimacy of principles of justice, etc., are contingent upon both their acceptance as well as the conclusion of their justifiable acceptability or their moral justification. In terms of justifiable acceptability or moral justification, there are some basic orientations that define this inquiry. One set of orientations is the distinction between teleological and deontological orientations, and I'll explain those here in a minute. A second basic distinction in orientation to moral justification is the distinction between monological approaches. For example, Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative procedure, which is based upon internal subjective reflection, and a teleological example of utilitarianism, where the good is conceived as an individual state of mind. So in these methodologies, the consideration does not justification does not hinge upon agreement, intersubjective agreement. In dialogical approaches, there's recognized an intersubjective call of the other, and that leads to deliberation and agreement as central to moral justification. That any kind of normative justification, moral or ethical, requires dialogue and deliberation among the parties to the consideration. Also, there's a fundamental distinction in orientation between ideal and non-ideal theory in normative theory. Ideal theory refers to the justifiability, the articulation and justifiability of ideal principles of justice, ideal social norms that are claimed to be what should be as our ideal. Non-ideal theory refers to both the critique of invalid justifications and unjustifiable norms and principles, as well as how to respond, what should guide our response and resistance to injustice. So if injustice exists in the society, are there any ethical and moral guidelines to resisting and transforming that injustice? So both ideal principles and non-ideal responses to injustice are also important orientations in normative inquiry. Deontological theories, it's a particular methodological approach to justification. And in deontological theories, what is right is defined and justified through a prior procedure of construction, which is independently of the conception of the good. And this is what John Rawls referred to as the priority of the right. And deontological theories are ground justification in respect for persons and are basically in their orientation to considerations. So a deontological theory and a deontological approach will ask what principle, what moral principle is most consistent with respect for persons. And often in deontological theories, especially in the dialogical and post-metaphysical approaches, there is a basic method of construction referred to as pure procedural justice, that the justifiability of pure procedural justice proceeds through deliberation, wherein the parties to the moral situation deliberate on what principles and values they would affirm as being most justifiable, but they're deliberating under the conditions of fairness. The conditions under which the deliberation occurs determines the reasonableness of determines the moral justifiability of the outcome of the deliberation. So whatever is agreed to under fair conditions is justifiable from this perspective. Teleological theories, on the other hand, proceed with a specification of an independent ultimate good. And then the right, what is right, is then defined as the realization of that good. There's a justified demand for the realization of the good on the grounds that it is of primary significance for human flourishing. So teleological theories will begin with what they argue from an impartial point of view as the ultimate good. For example, happiness or pleasure or preference satisfaction or human capability as an ultimate good. And then they define what is right in terms of consequences. They define what is right in terms of that which will lead to the realization of that good. So the right in teleological theories is derived from the good. The right, what is right, what is morally justifiable in terms of principle or action, is determined, is justified in terms of whether it can, whether it will realize in consequence the good. So teleological theories focus on the realization of states of affairs, and therefore they are outcome focused and consequentialist. That which is good, that which is right, it is that which leads to the best, or the best outcomes, the most good, the most common good. So there's a fundamental distinction in normative inquiry in these methodological approaches between a focus on the good and the realization of the good versus a focus on whether on human relationships, in particular respectful relationships in terms of respect for persons. But that which is right is that which is consistent with with human dignity and respect for persons, rather than that which leads to the best outcome. So one is outcome focused, the other is focused on respect and realization and respectful relations. And this leads us to the idea of the moral point of view. There are common elements of the methods of justifiable acceptability, which defines what we could call the moral point of view. And that point of view is the point of view of fairness. That all of these modern approaches to normative inquiry, both teleological and deontological, proceed from the point of view of fairness. And that fairness entails three fundamental elements. Equality and respect for persons is one element of fairness. That fairness is, and therefore justifiable acceptability, is contingent upon respecting persons as equals. Secondly, fairness entails impartiality, that in normative considerations, our judgments be free of the bias of self-interest, that a self-interested judgment is inherently unfair and therefore unjustifiable. And thirdly, the element or the principle of reciprocity, that principles and claims that others would agree to, or in other words, would not have a valid reason to reject. So reciprocity suggests the element of fairness of reciprocity suggests that we consider the point of view of others and consider whether they would have valid reason to reject our principle or our claim. Also, reciprocity suggests that we should not make claims for ourselves that we would reject for others. So to claim a certain right, a right to freedom for ourselves, but to deny it to others, let's say a right to vote, we claim a right to vote for ourselves, but we deny the same claim or the same right to others, is a violation of reciprocity. And thus, reciprocity entails a dialogical element of deliberation, agreement, and public reason, that we reason together in order to achieve a common agreement, a reasonable agreement that is reciprocal, impartial, and respectful of persons. Uh, and so we can from this point of view, we could ask, do our normative claims survive scrutiny? Can they survive scrutiny from within the moral point of view of fairness? So that's a basic starting point for normative inquiry, is uh, critical scrutiny from the moral point of view of fairness, is a basic overarching method of normative justification and inquiry. At this point, I I can I can go into greater detail into a variety of examples of how this might work. But I thought I should stop here and ask if there are any questions at this point. Any questions or comments at this point?
Go ahead.
Any questions?
I just wanted to comment that I thought that your comment about culture as not automatically being a source of justification was really, really important, and where a lot of deliberations fall down, because people turn to culture rather than to the common good that involves all pluralities, all different groups. So I thought
Okay.
that was really useful and important. That's all. It's not really a question, but I was really appreciated that. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenna. Appreciate that comment. Yes, that the fact that so widely accepted social norms can be unjust, can be unethical and immoral in the end, suggests that they require another level of justification. That the justification, a level of justification that's independent of their common acceptance. That they're contingent upon independent reasons, normative reasons that would justify them. Or in other words, we have to ask, not only is a social norm widely accepted, but does it also achieve justifiable acceptability? Is it in principle justifiable? Is its acceptance, is the acceptance of the social norm um, justifiable in itself, independently of its acceptance? And I know it gets a little perhaps convoluted here, but that's the basic idea of normative justification from the moral point of view. That any kind of claim of common public acceptability must have an independent basis, rational basis, is the idea. And one foundational set of reasons for the acceptability, the justified acceptability of social norms, is whether they are fair, whether they satisfy the criterion or standards of the moral point of view, the standards of fairness. Do they respect persons as equals? Are they impartial, or do they favor or discriminate against certain people? Are they reciprocal? Can they be commonly agreed to under fair conditions? Are they the result of a fair deliberation in the society? So
I've
that gets at the heart of I think normative justification.
I have a question. First of all, let me say, Betty Reardon, hello, nice to see you. Heard a lot about you, read a lot about you as well. So great to see you here. Um, and so you just hit on a really good word in terms of discrimination. Being the chair of my dissertation and my focus on the lived experiences of anti-racist center directors, anti-racism a lot of times uh, discusses this idea of racial discrimination for the result of racial equity, and a lot of that comes from Kendi. So I guess like I don't even know if it's a question, comment, or whatever the two may be, but I guess which because I also one of the descriptions that you had in there, it was that no one could, I guess, veto, if you will, coming from Rainer Force. So veto whatever the claim is if they don't have a valid reason. But we know in our society a lot of people have what would be surface level understandings of what the word discrimination means, but then ultimately what discrimination should be aimed to do if you're going to be discriminating against one community or the other for the result of having more equitable outcomes. So I guess the question I'm asking is, can you share what some of the biggest challenges are for folks that are engaging in that typical perspective to kind of navigate through in order to realize, or I guess to come to some conclusion, or I don't know, some general outcome through discussion and dialogue? That was very unclear. I know there's a
Quantas,
lot that I asked.
you ask a very important question, and it's really a question ultimately of education. How do we educate citizens uh, to have the capability to engage in ethical and moral discourse, and including justification? And of course, this can get very abstract for many people, and we wouldn't expect that the average citizen would uh, think or deliberate in at the highest level of abstraction. Uh, and that's why I think the appeal to the moral point of view um, is both valid and useful in terms of public deliberation among citizens. I think most people can have a sense of what is fair and what is unfair. Have a sense of respect for persons. Have a sense of impartiality, or have a sense of what bias means. Also have a sense of what reciprocity may entail. That we can't claim something for ourselves. That it's unfair to claim something for ourselves that we deny others. Uh, would seem to be a pretty intuitively appealing idea for most people. So I think the idea of the moral point of view of fairness is is an important foundation for determining what is reasonable um, uh, for in terms of normative judgments by citizens. I'm not sure if that fully answers your question, but
It's like a question that was kind of all over the place, and maybe even Dr. Kumar, who asked the question, is kind of getting to what I was talking about. But her question in the chat, how do we ascertain what values are universal and what are not, and who makes those decisions?
Yes, that's a very important question as well. From the moral point of view of fairness, it's the decision would be made by ideally all of us in deliberation under fair conditions. Betty, did you want to
Yeah, I want
jump
to make,
in?
I want to make two comments. My first comment is I thank you very much for this marvelous map. I think this is something that's very useful for those of us who are trying to sort through the overlaps and distinctions between ethics and moralities in regard to crucial public issues. One thing that I think we needed to do was sort out a lot of the things that you've sorted out here. But I see that there is a kind of disconnect in terms of our own discourse, and we as educators in discourse with those who are being educated, who are to become the citizens. And I think we have to be kind of understand that for most of this population, right and good are conflated. And they don't see those kinds of distinctions that you are pointing out as being so necessary. And it seems to me that one of the things that we need to do is to work with this map and try to develop a kind of pedagogy which is congenial to the average citizen. And I think a lot of the things that you are referring to as the common agreements that comes out of some perhaps intuition are in fact a demonstration of a kind of reflective capacity that we sometimes overlook as being the wonderful learning resource for us when we start to develop that kind of pedagogy. So I would just love to talk further about the pedagogical aspects of it. I think here we have the wonderful reflective map. But I'd like to see us also develop the pedagogy. You know, what are the processes of dialogic processes that we develop for the purpose of enabling others to do the kind of reasoning that you have outlined for us here.
Well, thank you for that, Betty. That's great. And I have a hunch that the specific methods that I haven't had a chance to talk about, but specific methods of normative justification can be used as pedagogies in the classroom, that we can engage students in these processes and procedures of normative inquiry in the classroom, and thereby develop their reflective and reasoning capabilities in this area through actually having them experience and work through the procedures themselves, and to have a deep reflection about what is right and what is good, and what is the relationship between the right and the good. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done there that could very well be done, and would be, I think, very very fruitful pedagogically.
Thank you.
Other thoughts?
Dr.
These
Summit, I
are
know
these are wonderful questions and comments.
it's been a great talk, and thank you so much. And I want to echo what Quatez said, and thank you, Betty Reardon, for being here as well. I've read a lot of your work as well. So I wonder if you might talk just a little bit more about some of these dialogical processes. I mean, obviously, we're thinking about right and good from our Western cultural perspective, but from some more traditionally dialectical conceptions, I sort of wonder if you might just talk about uh, the nature of maybe that universe intention as being a normative sort of theory and so on, or if that is just an extrapolation of a dialogical approach. Thanks. And I realize my connection's bad. I'm sorry. Thank you.
I'm not sure what. Could you say that again, Eric?
I just wonder how, because when we think about normative relationships between rightness and goodness, it's obviously we think about that, I think, from a very Western perspective. And I just wonder from a perspective that sees the universe as sort of a tension of opposites, a dialectical perspective, maybe traditionally, if is that an extension of a sort of a normative theory in your mind, or is that it's sort of a, if you, I don't know if that resonates or.
Well,
I may ask a better question after the methods.
I'm not exactly sure how to respond to your question, but I think
feel free to.
But I think it is very important to take to take a wider view and to take a global view and a comparative cross-cultural view of these issues as well. Of course, I'm steeped mainly in the Western tradition, especially the Western modern tradition of normative thinking, normative philosophy. But I think, and I've had a long interest in Eastern, so-called Eastern philosophies, Buddhism and Vedantic philosophy as well, which have also particular normative, very, very rich normative traditions of inquiry. And I think we should draw on those as well as in this kind of exploration, which may be more dialectical than our more linear Western points of view.
I think this is, I'm not sure if this, in context of what Quatez is saying, I'm not sure if I have a question formed or if this is more of a statement. But I think that what I'm hearing based on Dr. Kumar's question and Eric's question just recently, and in some ways Quatez is, well, I guess this is a question. So in definitions of justice, do you feel like those definitions of fairness and justice are in fact universal? So you named those three different aspects of fairness. Do you feel like those are common across Eastern normative approaches and Western normative approaches? Because I feel like that's part of the tension around some of the questions about whether or not that the conception of justice that we're talking about here in terms of morality is like a Western conception. And then the other part of this, I think, is I keep thinking about the ways in which culture determines for us what we value. Like culture determines what we think is good. And so that to me suggests that there's a possibility of a variety of different ethical normative approaches based on a variety of different cultures, and that's probably not like what we're hoping to discover. I think what we want to discover is, I think what Dr. Kumar was saying, that there's some sort of universal um, um, ethical values that everyone applies to or adheres to. Does that, I think there was a question in there. Does that make
Yes,
sense?
yes, yes. That's well put, Aaron. That's a great question. Um, well, there are, as far as I understand it, there are two basic sources of um, of normative validity, if you will, or two basic sources of fairness, perhaps. One source is culture, and what we what a culture takes, how the culture conceives of the person in a normative sense. So, and this is how, for example, John Rawls proceeds. So he proceeds with the idea of a person and a citizen within the cultural context of a liberal constitutional democracy. And based upon that political background, culture conceives the person and suggests that is commonly accepted in the culture, that we conceive of ourselves and we conceive of others as free and equal. Um, and that's a conception of the person that Rawls suggests is inherent in the culture, the background political culture of a liberal democracy. And then he proceeds to uh, build a procedure of normative justification based upon the idea of the person as free and equal. And his procedure models the characteristics of freedom and equality, especially equality. For example, in the original position, um, where we have to deliberate about principles of justice um, on equal terms under a veil of ignorance. So in that case, and if that was a valid procedure, then that might the outcome of that procedure, the outcome of the agreement, which is grounded in our conception of the person as free and equal, may be different in different cultures. Um, so the outcome of principles of justice may be different across cultures, across societies. So that's one potential way to look at it, and that would suggest that there isn't, um, from that perspective, if our normative judgments are grounded and their justification are grounded in the conception of the person that's inherent in our cultural orientation, then there is no, there probably won't be any universal standards that we would agree to, unless we could find agreement across cultures of a very basic conception of the person as equal, as having an equal inherent dignity. If there could arise, for example, a human rights culture, which is grounded in a conception of the person as possessing equal inherent dignity and a universal acceptance that each person is equal in their dignity. Another approach which isn't based in culture is more Kantian, in the sense that it's grounded in the nature of reason itself, or grounded in grounded in terms of the presuppositions that define what it means to be moral or what it means to be ethical. And this is in part the moral point of view, that there are certain elements or certain features that constitute the meaning of right, or the meaning of fairness, or the meaning of the good. And one could understand the moral point of view as taking this perspective, that from a reasonable point of view, there are certain elements that define the meaning of the right and the meaning of the good. And those elements, from that perspective, would be universal, universally presupposed in our understanding of what it means to be right or to be good. These are difficult philosophical questions.
Dr. Snoward, I have a question. I don't know. I think it is
Yes,
not. It is
Dr.
linked to
Kumar.
what you. Yes, you can't hear me.
Yes.
Yes. I know you're really well versed in the Bhagavad Gita, right? So what you were saying right now somehow reminded me of that. And particularly since you were citing a lot of the Western philosophers, but I know that you know all that the Eastern philosophy too. And just last week, I was having a discussion on one of the chat during about, I think it was chapter 13, and where Lord Krishna tells Arjuna that it is your duty to kill, it's your duty to fight this war, and so you have to accomplish do what you're expected to do, because that is your duty. And knowing that that Bhagavad Gita really lays out how one should live and how one should live a just and good life, how do you reconcile those two very different points of view? It was just a thought. I don't know. It suddenly struck
Yes.
me, and
Yeah. So it's a wonderful example, the Bhagavad Gita, and the dialogue between Krishna and Arjuna, and which is a normative dialogue about what, as you know, what Arjuna should do. So Arjuna is faced with the choice of resisting injustice. There's profound injustice in the world, and he is called upon to respond and resist that injustice. But at the same time, he sees the humanity of those actors on the opposite side who are committing injustice. He sees their humanity and respects their humanity. So he's caught in a dilemma. How do I respond to injustice and do my duty, fulfill my duty to resist injustice, while preserving the dignity and the value of human life, the human lives of my opponents? And of course, and that might be a universal moral dilemma that's expressed in the Bhagavad Gita. But I take inspiration from that, in that even in that ancient text, we have a dialogical methodology occurring.
yes,
That both that the dialogue between Krishna and Arjuna represents a dialogical normative procedure, and that the outcome perhaps is ideally some kind of agreement between them in the end.
in the end. Thank you. Though, of course, Arjuna is required to do what Krishna ultimately wants him to do because he's the Lord. But
Yeah.
But you're
Well,
right. Thank you.
yeah,
That was
yeah,
also, that was a nice explanation, and I
yeah.
appreciate that.
So Krishna's solution to the moral dilemma is a spiritual one.
Yes.
Transcend the duality, act from a state of being, uh, uh, established in being, perform action, and that's one answer to that Krishna offers in the dialogue to Arjuna.
Thank you.
Whether that's a satisfactory one is it's open to further inquiry.
Of course.
Yeah.
Thank you.
One, I think one of the one of the distinctions between empirical research and normative research, or normative inquiry and empirical inquiry, is that normative inquiry tends to be more less conclusive in its findings, and that's not that empirical science is always conclusive, because we never come to the full truth in empirical science either. Um, but there are ongoing and very ancient debates that we can come back to that are still illuminating for our moral judgments and thinking about ethical and moral issues. We probably wouldn't refer to an ancient Indian scientist in uh, contemporary psychology, uh, but we certainly, in normative inquiry, we those issues are still valid.
Dr. Schnauer, I just want to say thank you just for volunteering your time and this very enlightening discussion. And I really appreciate everybody making it easier for me in this role to not have to ask for people to bring up questions. I really appreciated you all taking part, so thank you. I know it's very difficult because we're not in a face-to-face setting, but I really would appreciate it if everybody would just unmute for a moment and just let's do the typical applause, right, for Dr. Schnauer. So here we go. So thank you all for coming today. And before you go, if I could just steal one more minute of your Friday afternoon. This is like the first of many presentations that faculty, students, and other scholars will have the opportunity to present as part of the Herb Innovation Center here at U Toledo. And so with that said, if you're interested in presenting on a research topic, sharing a work in progress, or talking about a project you completed, or talking about how do you do a certain methodological technique. For instance, in about 2 weeks, on April 16th, I will actually give a presentation from 3 to 5:30 on the 16th. It wasn't one of the announcements. If you don't have it, feel free to reach out to me and I can share that with you. And it will be just a gentle introduction to what is item response theory and how do you do it. And again, using Dr. Schnauer's language, it is an empirical approach for looking at how you develop, refine, and evaluate instruments. Again, it's not a replacement for coursework. It's just more of like, here's what it is, and maybe you want to dig deeper into a coursework. Also on that note too, if you have ideas for topics and maybe you don't want to present them, feel free to let me know and I will see if our lovely faculty and students are willing to take up those initiatives or ideas or pull from outside sources. Also, this presentation was recorded today, and so I will do some editing and also take the PowerPoint presentation that Dale has shared with us and put that on the Urban Innovation website in the next week or so. If you have any issues finding it, let me know. And again, the date is April 16th. Somebody asked. April 16th is a Wednesday, 3 to 5:30. And that session will be recorded just like all future sessions, just in case you can't make it at those times. So I don't think I have much more to share at this moment, unless somebody just wants to say goodbye first, and then we can all start going. Click, 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 click.
Well,
Thank you, Dale.
thank you, everyone, for coming. It's a pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Thanks
Thank
so
you,
much.
Michael.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Bye.
Great to see you,
Bye,
Betty.
bye.
Jenna. Good to see
Okay,
you,
you too.
Collins, Larry, Mohammed, Eric.
Thanks, Dale. Thank you
Dale.
very much, Dale.
All right.
Collins. Yeah.
Good to see you, Collins.